Number 10. Kagan Mousasi came into the UFC as the former Strikeforce light heavyweight champion. He was set to make his UFC debut against top-ranked light heavyweight Alexander Gustafsson at UFC on Fuel TV 9. Just a couple of days before the fight, Alexander Gustafsson suffered a cut above his eye and was removed from the card. Ilia Latifi stepped in on short notice and lost to Kagan Mousasi by a unanimous decision. After this victory, due to his size in the light heavyweight division, he made the drop down to the UFC middleweight division. At 185, he has notable victories over Mark Munoz, Dan Henderson, Vitor Belfort, Uriah Hall and many more. He has 8 wins and 3 losses in the UFC and will next face Chris Weidman at UFC 210. Number 9. Ronaldo Jacar Souza came into the UFC as the former Strikeforce middleweight champion. He made his UFC debut defeating Chris Cormier by an arm triangle in the first round at UFC on FX 8. He next put together a 4-fight winning streak and next suffered a split decision loss to Yoel Romero at UFC 194. He next defeated Vitor Belfort by TKO in the first round at UFC 198. He has 6 wins and 1 loss in the UFC and will next face Tim Boetsch at UFC 208. Number 8. Yoel Romero came into the UFC with a professional mixed martial arts record of 5 wins and 1 loss. He made his UFC debut defeating Clifford Starks at UFC on Fox 7. He currently holds an 8-fight winning streak and has notable victories over Derek Brunson, Tim Kennedy, Lyoto Machida, Ronaldo Jacar Souza and Chris Weidman. He currently holds 8 wins and no losses in the UFC and will likely face the current UFC middleweight champion Michael Bisping later this year. Number 7. Tyron Woodley came into the UFC as the former Strikeforce welterweight champion. He made his UFC debut defeating Jacar by knockout in the first round at UFC 156. He has notable victories over Josh Koscheck, Carlos Condit, Dong Young Kim and Kelvin Gastelum. He next captured the UFC welterweight title defeating Robbie Lawler by knockout at UFC 201. He has 6 wins, 3 losses and 1 draw in the UFC. He is next scheduled to defend his UFC welterweight title against Stephen Thompson in a rematch at UFC 209. Number 6. Luke Rockhold came into the UFC as the former Strikeforce middleweight champion. He made his UFC debut losing to Vitor Belfort by knockout at UFC on FX 8. He next put together a 4-fight winning streak defeating Kostas Philippou, Tim Boetsch, Michael Bisping and Lyoto Machida and next captured the UFC middleweight title defeating Chris Weidman by TKO in the 4th round at UFC 194. He has 5 wins and 2 losses in the UFC and in his last fight he lost his title to Michael Bisping at UFC 199. Number 5. Amanda Nunez came into the UFC with a professional mixed martial arts record of 8 wins and 3 losses. She made a UFC debut defeating Jermaine Durandamy by TKO in the first round at UFC Fight Night 31. In her next fight, she lost to Kat Zingano by TKO in the 3rd round at UFC 178. She next put together 3 solid wins defeating Shayna Baszler, Sarah McMahon and Valentina Shevchenko and captured the UFC Women's Bantamweight title defeating Miesha Tate by a rear naked choke at UFC 200. She recently defended her title defeating Ronda Rousey by TKO in the first round at UFC 207. Number 4. Miesha Tate came into the UFC as the former Strikeforce Women's Bantamweight champion. She made a UFC debut losing to Kat Zingano by TKO at the Ultimate Fighter 17 finale. She next lost to Ronda Rousey by an armbar in the 3rd round at UFC 168. After suffering 2 losses, she next put together a 4-fight winning streak defeating Liz Carmouche, Rin Nakai, Sarah McMahon and Jessica Ai and next captured the UFC Women's Bantamweight title defeating Holly Holm by a rear naked choke in the 5th round at UFC 196. She next lost her title to Amanda Nunes by a rear naked choke at UFC 200 and next lost a unanimous decision to Raquel Pennington at UFC 205. After the fight, she announced her retirement from the sport. Number 3. Robbie Lawler came into the UFC with a professional mixed martial arts record of 19 wins and 9 losses. He made his comeback fight in the UFC, defeating Josh Koscheck by TKO in the 1st round at UFC 157. He next defeated Bobby Volker and Rory McDonald and faced Johnny Hendricks for the vacant UFC welterweight title at UFC 171, where he lost the fight by a unanimous decision. He next defeated Jake Ellenberger and Matt Brown convincingly and captured the UFC welterweight title, defeating Johnny Hendricks by a split decision in a rematch at UFC 181. He next successfully defended his title twice, defeating Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit before losing it to Tyron Woodley at UFC 201. Number 2. Daniel Cormier came into the UFC as the former Strikeforce heavyweight champion. He made his UFC debut defeating Frank Mir by a unanimous decision at UFC on Fox 7. He next defeated Roy Nelson by a unanimous decision at UFC 166. Due to his teammate Cain Velasquez holding the UFC heavyweight title at the time, he made the drop down to the UFC light heavyweight division and successfully defeated Patrick Cummins and Dan Henderson, and next lost his UFC light heavyweight title fight to John Jones at UFC 182. After John Jones was stripped of his title, Daniel Cormier captured the UFC light heavyweight title, defeating Anthony Johnson at UFC 178. He successfully defended his title against Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 192 and next defeated Anderson Silva at UFC 200. He is next scheduled to defend his light heavyweight title against Anthony Johnson again at UFC 210. Number 1. Ronda Rousey made the biggest impact in the UFC out of all the fighters from Strikeforce. She helped build women's MMA and further elevated the sport in a lot of different ways. She made a UFC debut as the UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion, successfully defeating Liz Carmouche by an armbar at UFC 157. She next defended her title 5 times, defeating all of the top contenders in a devastating fashion. She next lost her UFC title to Holly Holm by knockout at UFC 193. She recently made a comeback at UFC 207 and lost to current champion Amanda Nunez by TKO in the first round. Ronda Rousey has done so much for the sport. You may love her or hate her, but she helped to grow both the UFC and women's MMA.